Washington, November 8, 2024. The Federal Reserve raised the benchmark interest rate by 0.25%, marking its fourth increase this year to combat high inflation. The Fed chair stated this measure aims to control rising prices and support economic stability. The transmission crackled across 17 star systems simultaneously, each word dropping like a stone into still water. Commander Vexari of the Galactic Conservation Fleet stood frozen at his console, his three eyes widening in disbelief. A human had just purchased the entire clutch of Draconix eggs from the black market auction on Terminus Station. Sarah Chen's name appeared on every priority alert screen in the known galaxy within minutes. The humans were known for many things across the stars. Their stubbornness, their strange ability to befriend nearly anything with a pulse, their ridiculous capacity to survive environments that would kill most species. But this was madness on a scale that even they had never attempted. The Draconix were not pets. They were not companions. They were apex predators from a world where the very air burned with sulfuric compounds, where mountains moved because they were actually sleeping megafauna, and where evolution had crafted the perfect killing machine. Full-grown Draconix stood 20 meters tall, could breathe plasma hot enough to melt starship hulls, and possessed intelligence that rivaled most spacefaring species. They also had a very particular problem with being confined, controlled, or domesticated. Every species that had ever tried to raise them, study them, or even approach their nesting grounds had learned the same brutal lesson. The Draconix were untamable. The last research team that attempted to study their eggs had been found as nothing more than carbon shadows on a crater wall. Sarah Chen had paid 47 million galactic credits for 12 eggs. The conservation log showed she had liquidated her entire family fortune, sold her ship, and borrowed against her future earnings for the next 60 years. The auction house had flagged the transaction as suspicious, but human currency was good, and greed spoke louder than common sense in the darker corners of the galaxy. Now every major news network was running the same story. A human woman had acquired the eggs of the most dangerous species in known space. The debate raged across countless worlds. Some called for her immediate arrest. Others insisted this was proof that humans were a danger to the galactic community. A few, mostly other humans, defended her right to do whatever foolish thing she wanted with her own money. Vexari pulled up her file. Sarah Chen, age 32 by Earth reckoning. Xenobiologist with specialization in extreme environment adaptation. She had published 17 papers on interspecies communication and had worked on 4 different worlds helping establish dialogue between colonists and native species. Her record was impeccable. Not a single violation, not even a parking citation on any registered world. That made it worse somehow. This was not some thrill-seeking idiot or black market dealer looking for a profit. This was an educated scientist who knew exactly what Draconix were capable of, and she had bought them anyway. The cargo manifest showed she had already transported the eggs off Terminus Station. Her destination was listed as Kepler 442b, a remote world in the outer territories that humans had begun terraforming 3 decades ago. It was barely habitable, with violent storms, volcanic activity, and an atmosphere that was still being adjusted by massive processing plants. Perfect for hiding something you did not want the galaxy to find. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session within hours. Vexari watched the live feed as representatives from 43 species argued about what should be done. The Vrellan ambassador insisted this was an extinction-level threat. The Cathari representative demanded immediate military intervention. Even the normally peaceful Luminari suggested that perhaps the eggs should be destroyed before they could hatch. Only the human ambassador, a stern-faced woman named Patricia Okonkwo, stood against them all. She argued that Sarah Chen had broken no laws, that the eggs had been legally purchased, and that every species had the right to exist. The council chambers erupted in angry clicks, whistles, and translated shouts. Did the humans not understand what they were defending? But Ambassador Okonkwo would not back down. She stood at her podium, hands gripped tight on its edges, and said something that made every being in that chamber go silent. She said that humanity had learned long ago that the most dangerous creatures often became that way because they were afraid, alone, or fighting to survive in a world that wanted them dead. She said that maybe, just maybe, nobody had ever tried to understand the Draconix because everyone was too busy being terrified of them. Vexari closed the feed. It was a pretty speech, but speeches did not change biology. Draconics were killers. It was in their genetic code, burned into their evolutionary history across millions of years. Whatever Sarah Chen thought she was doing, whatever noble intention drove her to waste her life savings, it would end the same way it always did. He filed his report recommending surveillance but not intervention. Let the humans learn this lesson themselves. The eggs would not hatch for another 8 months. That gave plenty of time to prepare containment protocols when everything inevitably went wrong. His superiors approved the recommendation. Monitoring stations were quietly established in orbit around Kepler 442b. Sensors were calibrated to detect the specific thermal signatures of hatching Draconix eggs. Emergency response teams were placed on standby. The galaxy watched and waited. Newsfeeds speculated endlessly about what would happen. Some created countdown timers to the projected hatch date. Others ran polls asking if Sarah Chen would survive the first day after the eggs opened. The odds were not in her favor. Betting markets across a dozen worlds gave her a 3% chance of living through the first week. But Sarah Chen did not seem to care about any of it. The few transmissions intercepted from Kepler 442b showed her working 18-hour days. She had constructed something massive on the surface, though satellite imagery could not penetrate the storm systems well enough to show details. Supply shipments arrived every few weeks. Building materials mostly, some food, very little else. Vexari found himself checking the surveillance reports more often than he should. There was something about this human that bothered him, some itch in his mind that he could not scratch. She had to know she was being watched. She had to know the entire galaxy expected her to fail, expected her to die. Yet she kept working, kept building, kept preparing for something that everyone else knew was impossible. 3 months passed, then 6. The eggs were growing, their shells developing the characteristic crystalline patterns that indicated healthy development. Sarah Chen sent no messages, gave no interviews, made no statements. She simply worked. The galaxy's attention began to drift to other matters. The story became old news, just another human doing something crazy that would probably end badly. But Vexari kept watching. Something was different this time. He could feel it in the way she moved, purposeful and calm, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. That scared him more than anything else, because if she was not crazy, if she actually had a plan, then maybe everything the galaxy thought it knew about the Draconix was about to change. Sarah Chen stood in the center of what she had built and allowed herself one moment of doubt. Just one. The structure around her rose like a cathedral made of steel and volcanic glass, its walls thick enough to withstand the plasma breath of a fully grown Draconix, its ceiling high enough that even a 20-meter creature could spread its wings. 12 chambers radiated from the central space, each one carefully designed, each one prepared for a specific purpose. The doubt passed. She had spent 3 years planning this before she ever placed her bid at that auction. 3 years of research that nobody else had bothered to do, because everyone assumed they already knew everything about the Draconix. 3 years of reading archaeological reports, analyzing recovered data from their extinct homeworld, studying every scrap of information that existed about a species that everyone feared, but nobody understood. She walked to the nearest egg, her hand hovering just above its crystalline surface. It was warm, pulsing with the life growing inside. Through the semi-transparent shell, she could see movement, shadows shifting as the creature within tested its growing strength. Another 2 weeks, maybe 3, and they would hatch. The galaxy expected her to die when that happened. They expected the hatchlings to emerge hungry, violent, and unstoppable. They were wrong. Not about the danger, but about the reason for it. Sarah pulled up the holographic display from her wrist computer, cycling through years of research. The Draconix homeworld had been destroyed 800 years ago, shattered by a rogue planetoid that struck with enough force to crack the crust and send the world spiraling into its sun. But before that happened, before the species became scattered refugees across the galaxy, they had been something else entirely. The archaeological evidence was fragmentary but clear. The Draconics had built cities, created art, developed philosophy and science. They had been a civilization, not just predators. Every skeleton ever found showed the same thing: specialized bone structures that indicated complex social behaviors, brain cases large enough for advanced cognition, and something else that nobody had paid attention to because they were too focused on the teeth and claws. The Draconix had been empaths. Their neural structure included specialized organs that allowed them to sense and share emotions with others of their kind. It was how they had formed their society, how they had cooperated despite being apex predators. It was also why they had become so violent after their world died. Imagine being born with the ability to feel what everyone around you feels, only to discover that everyone around you is terrified of you. Imagine growing up in laboratories, military installations, or being hunted by poachers, and the only emotions you can sense are fear, greed, and hatred. Imagine never once feeling safety, comfort, or love because nobody ever thought to offer those things to a monster. That was what the galaxy had done to the Draconics for 8 centuries. They had created their own monster, and then blamed the species for becoming exactly what they expected. Sarah was going to do something different. She was going to give them the one thing nobody else had even considered. She was going to give them a childhood. The 12 eggs were arranged in a circle around the central chamber. Sarah had studied how Draconics clutches were organized in the wild, back when there was still a wild for them to come from. The eggs were never meant to hatch in isolation. They were meant to hatch together, surrounded by family. Their first sensations meant to be connection and belonging. Every Draconix that had ever hatched in captivity had hatched alone, the first thing they sensed being the cold, clinical fear of researchers or the vicious anticipation of trainers trying to break them. The structure she had built was designed around this understanding. Each of the 12 chambers connected to the central space, but they also connected to each other through a network of tunnels. The hatchlings would be able to find each other, form bonds, learn to use their empathic abilities in a safe environment where the emotions they sensed would not be terror and violence. Sarah had prepared for every stage of their development. The first weeks would be critical. Draconix hatchlings imprinted on the first strong emotional presence they encountered. In nature, that had been their parents. In captivity, it had usually been fear, which created a feedback loop that turned them aggressive and unstable. She had spent the last 6 months training herself, working with meditation experts from 3 different species, learning techniques to control and project specific emotional states. When the eggs hatched, she would be there, and what they would sense from her would be calm, welcome, and absolute lack of fear, not because she was not afraid, but because she had learned to put that fear in a box and lock it away where it would not poison everything. The chambers were stocked with everything the hatchlings would need, food appropriate for each stage of development, water, minerals for their developing scales and bones, but more than that, she had filled the space with enrichment, puzzles made from heat-resistant materials, climbing structures that would challenge growing bodies, art, because the archaeological evidence suggested that Draconix had appreciated beauty, and she saw no reason why that would have changed. Her computer chimed. Incoming transmission from the orbital monitoring station. Sarah considered ignoring it, then decided against that. She had avoided communication for months, but soon the eggs would hatch, and she wanted at least one person to understand what she was trying to do before that happened. She accepted the call. Commander Vexari's 3-eyed face appeared on the screen, his expression unreadable in the way that most non-human faces were to people who had not spent years learning to read them. But Sarah had spent years learning exactly that. She could see concern there, and curiosity, and something that might have been hope buried deep underneath skepticism. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Vexari spoke, his words translated by the universal systems that made galactic communication possible. He asked if she knew what she was doing. He asked if she understood the danger. He asked if she had considered what would happen if she was wrong. Sarah looked around at the structure she had built, at the eggs that held sleeping lives, at the future she was trying to create. She told him that she knew exactly what she was doing. She told him that she understood the danger better than anyone, because she had actually bothered to study it instead of just reacting to it. She told him that she had considered what would happen if she was wrong, and she had decided that some things were worth the risk. Then she told him the truth that she had not shared with anyone else. She told him that the Draconix were not monsters. They were refugees, the last survivors of a dead world, and they had been treated like weapons or threats for so long that they had forgotten how to be anything else. She told him that someone needed to remember for them, to show them that they could be more than what fear and violence had made them. Vexari was quiet for a long time after that. Then he asked what she needed. Not what she wanted, but what she needed to succeed. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. some tight knot of isolation that she had been carrying for months. She gave him a list, mostly things that would help after the hatching, resources that she could not afford, but that would make the difference between this working and this becoming just another tragedy. He said he would see what he could do. He said that he hoped she was right because if she was not, then the galaxy would never forgive her. Sarah almost laughed at that. The galaxy had already decided not to forgive her. She had stopped caring about forgiveness the moment she realized that being right mattered more than being liked. The transmission ended. Sarah walked back to the eggs, placing her hand gently on the nearest one. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then the galaxy would learn that humans did not give up on people just because they were difficult. They did not abandon children just because those children had claws and could breathe fire. And they certainly did not let fear dictate which lives mattered and which ones did not. The egg pulsed warm beneath her palm. Inside, a Draconix hatchling dreamed of things it had never known, prepared for a world it had never seen. When it woke, it would not wake to fear or hatred or the cold efficiency of scientific observation. It would wake to hope. Sarah would make sure of that even if it killed her. The first egg cracked at dawn local time. Sarah had been awake for 36 hours, monitoring the subtle changes in temperature and movement that indicated the hatching was imminent. She sat in the central chamber, cross-legged on the warm floor, her breathing slow and controlled. Every meditation technique she had learned over the past months focused into this single moment. The crack spread across the crystalline surface like lightning frozen in glass. A second crack joined it, then a third. From inside came a sound that nobody had ever properly recorded, a chirping trill that resonated in frequencies both audible and not. Sarah felt it in her chest, in her bones, a vibration that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and speak directly to something deeper. She kept her breathing steady, her emotional state carefully maintained. Welcome, safety, calm. Those were the feelings she projected, not with words or actions, but with the simple certainty of her presence. She was not afraid. She refused to be afraid because fear would poison everything before it even began. The shell broke open. A small head emerged, covered in scales that shimmered between deep purple and midnight blue. The hatchling was the size of a large dog, nowhere near the massive creature it would eventually become. Its eyes opened, multifaceted and gleaming like cut gems, and those eyes fixed immediately on Sarah. She felt it then, the touch of the hatchling's empathic sense brushing against her consciousness. It was not invasive, not demanding. It was questioning, curious, reaching out to understand this strange being that smelled wrong but felt right. Sarah maintained her calm. Let the hatchling sense what she was offering. No threat, no fear, just presence and acceptance. The hatchling chittered, a sound almost like laughter. It tumbled out of its egg with the clumsy grace of any newborn, legs tangling as it tried to figure out how they worked. Sarah smiled but did not move forward. Let it come to her. Let it choose. That was important. The Draconix had to choose connection, not have it forced upon them. Another egg cracked. Then 2 more. Within the hour, all 12 were hatching and the chamber filled with the sounds of new life. The hatchlings called to each other, their empathic senses reaching out and finding siblings, finding connection, finding the thing they were meant to have but that no Draconix had experienced in 8 centuries. They were not alone. Sarah watched as they explored, as they found each other, as they began to form the bonds that would define their entire lives. One hatchling, slightly larger than the others with scales of deep crimson, seemed to be the boldest. It approached Sarah first, head tilted in that universal gesture of curiosity. She extended her hand slowly, letting it sniff, letting it investigate. The hatchling's tongue flicked out, tasting the air around her. Then it did something that made Sarah's heart skip. It pressed its head against her palm, leaning into the touch with a small rumbling sound of contentment. The gesture was so familiar, so much like any young creature seeking comfort, that Sarah almost forgot this was supposed to be the most dangerous being in the galaxy. The other hatchlings noticed. One by one they approached, their initial wariness dissolving as they sensed their siblings' contentment and Sarah's unwavering calm. Soon she was surrounded by 12 small dragons, all chirping and trilling and climbing over each other in their eagerness to investigate this strange, 2-legged creature that felt safe. The orbital monitoring station exploded with activity. Every sensor was recording, every feed being transmitted to a dozen different agencies. Commander Vexari stared at the screens in disbelief. The Draconics hatchlings were not attacking. They were not aggressive. They were behaving like any newborn creatures seeking comfort and security from a parent. The news networks picked up the feeds within minutes. Across the galaxy, beings of every species watched as Sarah Chen sat calmly while 12 Draconics hatchlings explored their new world and the strange being at its center. The betting markets crashed. The emergency response team stood down, confused. The experts who had predicted immediate violence scrambled to explain how their predictions could have been so wrong. But Sarah was not paying attention to any of that. She was focused entirely on the 12 lives in her care. The hatchlings were hungry, as all newborns are. She guided them to the feeding chambers where she had prepared food, nutrient-rich compounds that would fuel their rapid growth. They ate with the messy enthusiasm of babies everywhere, getting more food on themselves than in their mouths. After eating, they were tired. Sarah had prepared nesting spaces, warm and secure, filled with soft materials that would not scratch their delicate scales. The hatchlings piled together in one of the chambers, a tangle of wings and tails and sleepy chirps. The bold crimson one, whom Sarah had mentally named Cardinal, claimed a spot closest to the entrance where it could see her. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax, just slightly. The first test was passed. The hatchlings had imprinted on safety instead of fear, but this was only the beginning. Draconics grew fast, their bodies and minds developing at a rate that would seem impossible to most species. Within weeks, they would be too large for her to physically control. Within months, they would have their full cognition and their plasma breath. Everything depended on these first weeks, on building trust and teaching them that they were safe, that they were valued, that they were more than the monsters the galaxy expected them to be. Commander Vexari requested another call. This time, Sarah accepted immediately. She owed him that much, considering he had convinced several supply companies to extend her credit and had quietly arranged for emergency medical supplies to be delivered. Without her asking, Vexari looked different than their last conversation. The skepticism was still there, but it was fighting with something else. Wonder, maybe, or hope. He congratulated her on surviving the hatching. His tone suggested he had not expected to be able to say those words. Sarah smiled, tired but genuine. She explained what she had learned, the confirmation of her research. The Draconics were empaths, their aggression a learned response to the fear and hatred they had always been greeted with. Given the chance to imprint on safety, they were no more inherently violent than any other intelligent species. Vexari processed this information, his 3 eyes blinking in sequence the way his species did when thinking deeply. He asked what her plans were now. The galaxy was watching. Everyone who had predicted her death was now demanding explanations, predictions, contingency plans. What would happen when the hatchlings grew large enough to be truly dangerous? Sarah looked at the sleeping tangle of hatchlings, at the future that was now possible instead of inevitable. She told Vexari that she would raise them the way any children should be raised, with patience, with boundaries, with education and care. She would teach them about their heritage, about the civilization their ancestors had built. She would show them that they could be proud of what they were without being defined by fear. And most importantly, she would teach them that they were not alone, that they did not have to be monsters, and that the galaxy could learn to see them as people if they were willing to see themselves that way first. Vexari was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised Sarah. He said that his government had been watching, that they had seen what she accomplished, and that they were prepared to offer official support. Not everyone was convinced, not yet, but enough beings across enough worlds were willing to admit that maybe the humans were onto something. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Support meant resources. It meant legitimacy. It meant that this crazy, impossible thing might actually work. She thanked Vexari, her voice rough with emotion she had not allowed herself to feel for months. The transmission ended. Sarah sat in the dim light of the chamber, listening to the soft breathing of 12 sleeping dragons. The galaxy had spent 8 centuries being afraid of the Draconics. It had taken 1 human woman and 12 eggs to prove that maybe, just maybe, the problem was not the dragons at all. It was the fear, and fear, unlike dragons, could be overcome. 3 months after hatching, the 12 Draconics had grown to the size of horses. Their personalities had emerged distinct and clear, each one unique yet connected to the others through bonds that ran deeper than Sarah had even imagined. Cardinal remained the boldest, always first to investigate new things, appointed himself as the unofficial leader of the clutch. Beside him was Azure, whose scales shifted between blue and green depending on the light. The most curious one who spent hours examining everything with careful attention. Then there was Ember, whose temperament matched her orange-gold coloring, fierce and protective of her siblings. Shadow preferred the darker corners of the structure, quieter than the others but with a sharp intelligence that missed nothing. Opal's scales sparkled with hints of every color, and her nature was gentle, often the one to soothe conflicts between siblings. The others each had their own names now, their own quirks, their own ways of being in the world. Sarah had documented everything. Growth rates, behavioral patterns, cognitive development, emotional responses. The data would have been worth fortunes to researchers across the galaxy, but she shared it freely. Every week she uploaded detailed reports to the galactic database. Anyone who wanted to understand the Draconics, truly understand them, now had the information they needed. The response had been overwhelming. Scientists from 40 different worlds requested permission to visit. Some governments that had initially condemned her project now sent formal apologies and offers of funding. The media coverage had shifted from predicting disaster to documenting an unprecedented success. Sarah Chen had become famous, though she tried to ignore that part. What mattered was the 12 young dragons learning to navigate their world. Today's lesson was about flight. The hatchlings had been attempting small hops and glides for weeks now, their wings growing stronger each day. Sarah had designed the central chamber with this in mind. High ceilings and air currents generated by carefully placed vents that would help them learn to catch thermal updrafts. Cardinal was determined to be the first to achieve sustained flight. Sarah watched as he climbed to one of the elevated platforms, his wings spreading wide. The other 11 watched from below, their empathic senses locked onto their brother, sharing his anticipation and nervousness. This was what made them special, Sarah thought. They did not just watch each other learn. They experienced it together. Cardinal launched himself into the air. His wings beat powerfully once, twice, and then he was gliding, riding the artificial thermal with growing confidence. The other hatchlings erupted in excited chirps and trills, their joy cascading through their empathic network. Cardinal circled the chamber once, then twice, before landing with only slight clumsiness. The others rushed to try, each one learning not just from their own attempts but from the experiences of their siblings. By evening, all 12 could manage basic flight. Sarah noted it in her records, adding observations about how their empathic abilities seemed to accelerate learning. When one Draconix figured something out, the others could sense not just the success but the understanding behind it. A supply ship arrived that evening, the third one this month. Commander Vexari had made good on his promises. The shipments included everything Sarah requested and things she had not even thought to ask for. Better food supplies, educational materials, even entertainment media from across the galaxy. Vexari had included a personal message suggesting that the hatchlings might benefit from seeing how other species lived and thought. Sarah set up a viewing area. Curious to see how the Draconics would respond to alien media, she started with something simple, a nature documentary about a peaceful herbivore species on a water world. The 12 dragons settled around the display, their attention completely focused. What happened next surprised even Sarah. The hatchlings did not just watch. They reacted emotionally to what they saw, chirping with distress when predators threatened the herbivores, humming with contentment during peaceful scenes. More than that, they began asking questions, their sounds forming patterns that Sarah had learned to recognize as inquiries. They wanted to know why the creatures in the documentary looked different. They wanted to understand the relationships between species, the ecosystems, the way life worked on worlds they had never seen. Sarah spent hours that night explaining, using simple terms at first but quickly realizing that the Draconics understood far more than she had given them credit for. Their cognitive development was accelerating beyond what her research had predicted. By the time she put them to bed that night, Sarah suspected she was not raising children in the traditional sense. She was raising something closer to students, young minds that were growing faster and reaching further than she had imagined possible. The next day brought visitors. Not researchers or politicians, but something Sarah had not expected. A delegation of Draconic survivors, 3 adults who had managed to survive in the wild spaces of the galaxy, arrived at Kepler 442b. They had heard about the hatchlings, about what Sarah was attempting, and they had come to see if it was true. Sarah met them at the landing pad, her heart pounding. Adult draconics were massive, their presence overwhelming even when they were trying to be calm. The leader, an ancient male whose scales had faded to almost silver with age, regarded her with eyes that held centuries of pain and wariness. She welcomed them, her voice steady despite her nervousness. She explained what she had done, what she had learned, what she hoped to achieve. The old male listened without interrupting, his empathic senses undoubtedly reading every emotion she was not saying out loud. Then he asked to see the hatchlings. Sarah led them to the central chamber, where the 12 young draconics were engaged in what had become their morning routine, a combination of exercise, play, and learning. The hatchlings sensed the adults before they saw them, their heads snapping up in unison. What happened next made Sarah's throat tight. The hatchlings did not react with fear or aggression. They reacted with joy, rushing toward the adults with excited chirps and trills. The adult draconics stood frozen, clearly not expecting this. In their experience, young draconics were either terrified or aggressive, never welcoming. Cardinal reached the old male first, pressing his head against the ancient dragon's leg in the same gesture of affection he often gave Sarah. The other hatchlings crowded around the 3 adults, their empathic network reaching out, trying to connect, trying to share the joy and safety they had always known. Sarah watched as the old male's composure cracked. He lowered his massive head to Cardinal's level, and she saw something in his ancient eyes that might have been tears if dragons could cry. He spoke, his voice a deep rumble that the translator struggled to render into human speech. He said he had forgotten what young ones were supposed to be like. He said he had thought their species had lost the ability to feel anything but rage and fear. The 3 adults stayed for hours. They played with the hatchlings, teaching them things that Sarah could not, the small cultural touchstones that had survived in memory if nowhere else. They sang songs in the old language, told stories about the world that had been lost, shared knowledge that had been passed down through generations of survivors. When they finally prepared to leave, the old male turned to Sarah. He thanked her, his voice heavy with emotion that his translator could barely capture. He said that she had given his species something they thought was gone forever. Not just survival, but hope. The chance to be themselves again, to remember that they were more than the monsters the galaxy had made them. He asked if he and the others could return, if they could help teach the hatchlings about their heritage. Sarah agreed immediately, realizing that this was exactly what the young draconics needed. They needed connection not just with her, not just with each other, but with their own history and culture. After the adults left, the hatchlings were different. Calmer somehow, more centered. They spent the evening discussing what they had learned, their voices creating a complex harmony of questions and observations. Sarah sat among them, adding her own thoughts when asked, but mostly just listening to 12 young minds processing their first real connection to their own species. That night, as the hatchlings settled for sleep, Cardinal approached Sarah. He did something he had never done before. He spoke, not in chirps or trills, but in careful, halting human words. The translator picked it up, rendered it clear. He said thank you. He said he understood now what she had done, what she was still doing. He said that the draconics would not forget. Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her face against his warm scales. She told him that he did not have to thank her. She told him that every child deserved what she had given them: safety, love, the chance to grow into whoever they were meant to be. The fact that the galaxy had forgotten that truth for the draconics was not their fault. It was the galaxy's failure, not theirs. The galaxy was learning that failure now, watching 12 young dragons prove that everything they thought they knew was wrong. 6 months into their lives, the 12 draconics were developing their plasma breath. This was the moment that had caused the most concern among the orbital monitors and the various agencies tracking Sarah's project. Plasma breath was what made draconics truly dangerous, the ability that had killed so many researchers and trainers in the past. Everyone was watching to see how Sarah would handle this critical stage. She handled it with education, boundaries, and trust. The first sign came when Ember accidentally scorched a wall during an excited moment. The young dragon had been startled by a sudden noise, and instinct had triggered a response before conscious thought could stop it. A brief jet of superheated plasma had left a black mark on the supposedly fireproof wall. Ember had been devastated, her distress rippling through the empathic network and affecting all her siblings. She curled into a tight ball, refusing to move, convinced she had done something terrible. Sarah approached slowly, projecting calm and understanding. She explained that this was natural, that learning to control new abilities took time, and that making mistakes was part of growing up. But she also explained that with power came responsibility. The plasma breath was dangerous, capable of killing, and that meant the Draconix needed to learn when to use it and when to hold back. It was not a punishment to learn control. It was a gift, the difference between having power and being controlled by it. Over the next weeks, Sarah set up training protocols. The 12 Draconix learned to meditate, to recognize the sensation that preceded the plasma generation, to consciously engage or suppress the reflex. They practiced in isolated chambers with reinforced walls, learning precision and restraint. Cardinal was the first to achieve perfect control, able to produce anything from a small flame to a focused cutting torch, each one exactly as intended. The others learned from his success, their empathic network again proving invaluable for education. When one Draconix figured out the mental state needed for control, the others could sense it, could replicate it. Within a month, all 12 had mastered the basics. Within 2, they could perform precision work that would have amazed any being who still believed they were mindless killing machines. Sarah documented everything and shared it openly. She showed the galaxy that the Draconix plasma breath was not a weapon that could not be controlled. It was a tool, powerful and dangerous, yes, but capable of being wielded with precision when the wielder had been taught properly and given reason to care about the consequences. The old male, who had introduced himself as Kronos, returned frequently now. He brought other adult Draconix with him each time, a slowly growing community of survivors who had spent their lives in isolation. They watched the hatchlings with a mixture of joy and sorrow, seeing what they had been denied, what their entire species had lost. Kronos began teaching the hatchlings their history properly, not the sanitized version that appeared in galactic databases, but the real story. He told them about the great cities their ancestors had built, about the philosophy and art their civilization had created. He taught them the old songs, the traditional stories, the values that had defined Draconix culture before the end of their world. The hatchlings absorbed it all with hunger, their young minds desperate for connection to their heritage. They began incorporating the old ways into their daily lives, creating their own versions of traditional rituals, adapting ancient customs to their new reality. Sarah watched this cultural renaissance with fascination, documenting it all while being careful not to interfere. This was theirs, something they needed to discover and claim for themselves. But teaching history meant teaching tragedy. Kronos did not hide the truth about what had happened after the homeworld was destroyed. He told them about the laboratories, the military installations, the endless cycle of fear and violence that had defined Draconix existence for 8 centuries. He told them about hatchlings who had died because they were considered too dangerous to live, about adults who had been hunted, about a species that had become refugees in a galaxy that saw them only as threats. The 12 young Draconix listened, and their empathic network carried the weight of that history between them. Sarah felt it too, an echo of grief and rage that resonated through the chamber. She worried they might respond with anger, with hatred toward the species that had treated them so badly. Instead, they responded with determination. Azure was the first to speak, her voice clear and certain. She said that they would prove the galaxy wrong. They would show everyone that Draconix could be more than killers. They would honor their ancestors by being what the Draconix had always been meant to be, before fear twisted everything. The others echoed her sentiment, each adding their own voice to the declaration. They would be better. They would be proof. They would change the story. Sarah had never been more proud of anything in her life. News of the hatchlings' progress had spread far beyond what Sarah had anticipated. Requests for visits poured in from educational institutions, diplomatic corps, even military organizations wanting to understand how she had accomplished the impossible. Sarah accepted some, rejected others, always prioritizing what was best for the 12 Draconix in her care. One request she could not refuse came from the Galactic Council itself. They wanted the hatchlings to appear before the full assembly, to be seen by representatives from every spacefaring species. It was unprecedented, potentially dangerous and absolutely necessary if the Draconics were ever going to be accepted as people rather than threats. Sarah discussed it with the 12. They were old enough now to make decisions about their own lives, to understand the implications of such an appearance. They talked about it for hours, debating the risks and opportunities, considering how their actions might affect not just themselves but every Draconix alive. Cardinal was the one who finally crystallized their decision. He said they had been given something precious, a chance to grow up without fear, and that gift came with responsibility. If they could use their position to change how the galaxy saw their species, then they had an obligation to try. The others agreed. Preparations began immediately. The hatchlings would need to travel to the capital world, appear before thousands of beings who had spent their entire lives believing Draconics were monsters. It would be the greatest test yet, not just of what Sarah had taught them, but of who they had chosen to become. Commander Vexari arrived personally to oversee the logistics. His government was providing transport, security, and diplomatic support. He looked at the 12 Draconics, now nearly full-grown and magnificent in their power, and shook his head in wonder. He told Sarah that he had been wrong about her, that they all had. She had not just saved 12 lives. She had given hope to an entire species and forced the galaxy to confront its own prejudices. Sarah did not feel like a hero. She felt like a teacher watching her students prepare for their final exam, nervous and proud in equal measure. The 12 Draconics were ready. She knew that intellectually. But emotionally, the part of her that had bonded with them as hatchlings wanted to protect them from the judgment and fear they would face. The night before their departure, Sarah gathered the 12 together one last time in the chamber where they had hatched. She wanted to say something profound, something that would prepare them for what was coming. Instead, she simply told them the truth. She told them she was proud of them, that they had exceeded every hope she had held, and that whatever happened next, they had already proven themselves to be exactly who they were meant to be. Cardinal spoke for all of them, his voice resonating through the chamber. He said they understood what she had done for them, the risk she had taken, the life she had devoted to giving them a chance. He said they would not waste that gift. They would show the galaxy that the Draconics deserved to exist, not as monsters to be feared or weapons to be controlled, but as people with their own value and dignity. The other 11 added their voices, creating a harmony that Sarah felt in her bones. They thanked her, not just with words but with the emotions flowing through their empathic network, letting her feel what she meant to them. Family, teacher, friend. The being who had looked at 12 eggs and seen not threats but children who deserved a chance. Sarah slept that night surrounded by 12 dragons, their breathing synchronized, their dreams shared through empathic bonds that nothing could break. Tomorrow they would leave this shelter she had built. Tomorrow they would step into a galaxy that did not trust them, did not want them, did not believe they could be anything but dangerous. Tomorrow they would prove everyone wrong. The capital world of the Galactic Council was named Unity, though Sarah had always found that name somewhat ironic given how much arguing happened there. The massive structure that housed the council chambers could be seen from orbit, a testament to cooperation between species that often agreed on very little. Today those chambers were more crowded than they had been in decades. The transport ship carrying Sarah and the 12 Draconics descended through carefully monitored approach vectors. Security was intense, not because anyone feared the young dragons would attack, but because there were still many beings across the galaxy who believed the only good Draconix was a dead one. Protests had formed outside the council building, some supporting the Draconix' right to exist, others demanding they be destroyed before they could become threats. Sarah stood with the 12 in the transport's main cabin, watching the planet grow larger through the viewports. The Draconix were nervous, she could tell, though they hid it well. They had practiced for this, rehearsed their presentation dozens of times, but practice was different from reality. They would be walking into a room full of beings who feared them, who had spent lifetimes believing their species was incapable of peaceful coexistence. Commander Vexari appeared on the communication screen, his 3 eyes showing concern. He informed them that the council had implemented additional security measures. Force fields would separate the Draconix from the audience. Weapon suppressors would be active, preventing any use of plasma breath. The measures were described as standard precautions, but Sarah knew what they really were. The council was still afraid. Cardinal growled low in his throat, and Sarah felt the ripple of anger through the empathic network. She placed a hand on his scales, projecting calm. She reminded him that fear was learned and could be unlearned, but only if they proved worthy of trust. Getting angry at precautions would just reinforce the prejudices they were trying to break. The young dragon settled, though his frustration remained evident. The others drew closer, their empathic bonds tightening, drawing strength from each other. This was why Sarah had raised them together, why the clutch bond was so important. Alone, they might have broken under the pressure. Together, they were unshakable. The landing was smooth. The moment the transport doors opened, flash photography and recording devices lit up the docking bay like stars. Media from every major species had gathered, all trying to get the first clear images of the notorious Draconics hatchlings. Sarah stepped out first, shielding her eyes from the glare, then moved aside to let the 12 follow. The crowd's reaction was immediate and mixed. Gasps of fear, murmurs of wonder, shouts of both protest and support. The Draconics walked with dignity, their heads held high, their movements controlled and careful. They had agreed to wear translators attached to collar-like devices around their necks, allowing their words to be understood by everyone present. Security forces lined the path to the council building, an unnecessary show of force that made Sarah's jaw tighten. But the Draconics ignored it, walking calmly through the corridor of weapons and suspicious glares. They had discussed this possibility, how they would be treated as threats before being given a chance to prove otherwise. Knowing it would happen did not make it easier, but it did make it manageable. The council chambers were vast, designed to accommodate representatives from species of every size and environmental need. The 12 Draconics were led to a platform in the center, surrounded on all sides by the tiered seating where delegates watched from behind protective barriers. The force field activated as they took their positions, a shimmering wall between them and everyone else. Sarah stood outside the field, forced to watch from the sidelines as per council rules. This was the Draconics' moment, not hers. She could only watch and hope that everything she had taught them would be enough. The council speaker, a crystalline being whose species communicated through light patterns, opened the session. The charges were read, an ancient formality that felt absurd in this context. The Draconics were not on trial, technically, but the language used made it clear that they were being evaluated, judged for worthiness to exist. Cardinal stepped forward, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics and his translator. He began not with a defense but with a history lesson. He spoke about the Draconics' homeworld, about the civilization that had thrived there for millennia. He talked about the art, the philosophy, the science his ancestors had developed. He described a species that had valued cooperation despite being apex predators, that had used their empathic abilities to create bonds stronger than blood. Then he talked about the end. The destruction of their world, the scattering of survivors, and the 8 centuries of persecution that followed. He did not blame anyone specifically. He simply stated facts, cold and undeniable, letting the assembled representatives understand what had been done to his species. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably. Others remained stoic, unmoved by what they clearly saw as justification rather than explanation. Cardinal expected this. He moved to the next part of his presentation. Azure stepped forward, joining her brother. She spoke about their hatching, about waking to safety instead of fear, about learning that they could be more than monsters if someone believed in them enough to give them a chance. She described their education, their growth, the discovery of their own heritage, and the joy of connecting with adult survivors who had thought their culture dead. One by one, the other 10 added their voices. Ember talked about learning control, about understanding that power meant responsibility. Shadow discussed philosophy, comparing Draconics' ethical frameworks to those of other species, showing they were not so different. Opal spoke about art, displaying holographic images of sculptures and paintings the 12 had created. Beauty born from beings the galaxy had declared incapable of creating anything but destruction. The presentation was masterful, coordinated through their empathic network, to create a narrative that was impossible to ignore. They were not asking for pity. They were demanding recognition, insisting that the galaxy acknowledge them as people rather than threats. When they finished, silence filled the chamber. Then the questions began. Some were genuine, seeking to understand. Others were hostile, trying to find flaws to prove that this was all a performance hiding their true nature. The 12 answered everything with patience and honesty, never losing composure even when the questions became insulting. One delegate, a military officer from a species that had lost soldiers to wild draconics, stood and demanded to know what would happen when the 12 reproduced, when there were more of them. Would they still be peaceful, or would numbers bring back their violent nature? Cardinal did not flinch. He acknowledged the concern, then pointed out that every species asked that same question about every other species when they first encountered them. The draconics were no different. They would raise their children with the same values they had been taught, with the same emphasis on responsibility and control. They would be a community, not a threat if they were given the same opportunities everyone else took for granted. Hours passed. The questions eventually slowed, then stopped. The council speaker called for a recess, allowing delegates to confer before making any decisions. The force field remained active, keeping the 12 isolated while the galaxy decided their fate. Sarah finally managed to get close enough to the field to make eye contact with Cardinal. She could not touch him, could not offer physical comfort, but she hoped her presence was enough. The young dragon met her gaze and nodded once, a gesture he had learned from her. They would be okay. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The recess lasted 3 hours. When the delegates returned, the chamber felt different, charged with anticipation. The speaker stood, light patterns flickering across crystalline form. The decision would be announced not through a single voice, but through a vote, displayed for everyone to see. The screens activated, showing the tally in real time. For recognition of Draconic's personhood. Against. Abstaining. The numbers climbed and Sarah felt her heart hammering. This was it. Everything she had worked for. Everything the 12 had proven, all coming down to a vote by beings who had never given the Draconics a fair chance before. The final tally appeared. Sarah felt her knees weaken. The 12 Draconics stood perfectly still, their empathic network carrying emotions too complex for words. The decision was narrow, closer than it should have been, but it was decisive. The Galactic Council officially recognized the Draconics as a sentient species with full rights and protections under galactic law. They were people. Finally, after 8 centuries of persecution, they were legally people. The chamber erupted. Some delegates celebrated, others protested, and a few simply sat in stunned silence. But it did not matter what any individual thought anymore. The law was clear. The Draconics could not be hunted, could not be experimented on, could not be denied the basic rights that every other species enjoyed. The force field dropped. Sarah rushed forward and the 12 dragons surrounded her, their joy palpable through their shared emotions. They had done it. They had proved themselves not just to survive but to be recognized as worthy of existing on their own terms. Commander Vexari appeared, his expression somewhere between relief. Between them and everyone else. Sarah stood outside the field, forced to watch from the sidelines as per council rules. This was the Draconics' moment, not hers. She could only watch and hope that everything she had taught them would be enough. The council speaker, a crystalline being whose species communicated through light patterns, opened the session. The charges were read, an ancient formality that felt absurd in this context. The Draconics were not on trial technically, but the language used made it clear that they were being evaluated, judged for worthiness to exist. Cardinal stepped forward, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics and his translator. He began not with a defense but with a history lesson. He spoke about the Draconics' homeworld, about the civilization that had thrived there for millennia. He talked about the art, the philosophy, the science his ancestors had developed. He described a species that had valued cooperation despite being apex predators, that had used their empathic abilities to create bonds stronger than blood. Then he talked about the end, the destruction of their world, the scattering of survivors, and the 8 centuries of persecution that followed. He did not blame anyone specifically. He simply stated facts, cold and undeniable, letting the assembled representatives understand what had been done to his species. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably. Others remained stoic, unmoved by what they clearly saw as justification rather than explanation. Cardinal expected this. He moved to the next part of his presentation. Azure stepped forward, joining her brother. She spoke about their hatching, about waking to safety instead of fear, about learning that they could be more than monsters if someone believed in them enough to give them a chance. She described their education, their growth, the discovery of their own heritage, and the joy of connecting with adult survivors who had thought their culture dead. One by one, the other 10 added their voices. Ember talked about learning control, about understanding that power meant responsibility. Shadow discussed philosophy, comparing Draconic's ethical frameworks to those of other species, showing they were not so different. Opal spoke about art, displaying holographic images of sculptures and paintings the 12 had created, beauty born from beings the galaxy had declared incapable of creating anything but destruction. The presentation was masterful, coordinated through their empathic network to create a narrative that was impossible to ignore. They were not asking for pity. They were demanding recognition, insisting that the galaxy acknowledge them as people rather than threats. When they finished, silence filled the chamber. Then the questions began. Some were genuine, seeking to understand. Others were hostile, trying to find flaws to prove that this was all a performance hiding their true nature. The 12 answered everything with patience and honesty, never losing composure even when the questions became insulting. One delegate, a military officer from a species that had lost soldiers to wild Draconics, stood and demanded to know what would happen when the 12 reproduced, when there were more of them. Would they still be peaceful, or would numbers bring back their violent nature? Cardinal did not flinch. He acknowledged the concern, then pointed out that every species asked that same question about every other species when they first encountered them. The Draconics were no different. They would raise their children with the same values they had been taught, with the same emphasis on responsibility and control. They would be a community, not a threat, if they were given the same opportunities everyone else took for granted. Hours passed. The questions eventually slowed, then stopped. The council speaker called for a recess, allowing delegates to confer before making any decisions. The force field remained active, keeping the 12 isolated while the galaxy decided their fate. Sarah finally managed to get close enough to the field to make eye contact with Cardinal. She could not touch him, could not offer physical comfort, but she hoped her presence was enough. The young dragon met her gaze and nodded once, a gesture he had learned from her. They would be okay. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The recess lasted 3 hours. When the delegates returned, the chamber felt different, charged with anticipation. The speaker stood, light patterns flickering across crystalline form. The decision would be announced not through a single voice, but through a vote displayed for everyone to see. The screens activated, showing the tally in real time. For recognition of Draconic's personhood, against abstaining. The numbers climbed, and Sarah felt her heart hammering. This was it. Everything she had worked for, everything the 12 had proven, all coming down to a vote by beings who had never given the Draconics a fair chance before. The final tally appeared. Sarah felt her knees weaken. The 12 Draconics stood perfectly still, their empathic network carrying emotions too complex for words. The decision was narrow, closer than it should have been, but it was decisive. The Galactic Council officially recognized the Draconics as a sentient species with full rights and protections under galactic law. They were people. Finally, after 8 centuries of persecution, they were legally people. The chamber erupted. Some delegates celebrated, others protested, and a few simply sat in stunned silence. But it did not matter what any individual thought anymore. The law was clear. The Draconics could not be hunted, could not be experimented on, could not be denied the basic rights that every other species enjoyed. The force field dropped. Sarah rushed forward, and the 12 dragons surrounded her, their joy palpable through their shared emotions. They had done it. They had proved themselves not just to survive, but to be recognized as worthy of existing on their own terms. Commander Vexari appeared, his expression somewhere between relief and disbelief. He told Sarah that she had changed the galaxy, that what happened here today would be studied for generations. Sarah barely heard him. She was too busy being overwhelmed by 12 dragons expressing their gratitude and triumph through empathic bonds that felt like love, given form. Outside the council building, the protests had transformed. Those who had opposed the Draconics were leaving, some angry, others thoughtful. But those who had supported them remained, celebrating a victory that meant different things to different beings, but represented hope to everyone who had ever been judged for what they were, rather than who they chose to be. The galaxy had learned something today. Fear could be overcome. Prejudice could be challenged, and sometimes all it took was one person willing to see past the monster everyone else believed in, and 12 young lives given the chance to prove they were so much more. 5 years after the council vote, Sarah stood once again on Kepler 442b, but the world had transformed beyond recognition. Where once there had been a single shelter built for 12 hatchlings, now there stood a proper settlement. Buildings designed to accommodate Draconic's physiology dotted the landscape. Connected by wide pathways and gathering spaces, the population had grown to nearly 50, a combination of the original 12, adult survivors who had finally found a place to call home, and 3 new clutches of eggs waiting to hatch. The shelter she had built for the original 12 still stood at the heart of it all, preserved as both memorial and reminder. This was where it had started, where one human woman had bet everything on the belief that monsters were made, not born. She had been right, and the galaxy was still adjusting to what that meant. Sarah walked through the settlement, greeting Draconics who had become friends over the years. Kronos, the ancient male who had been the first to visit, now served as an unofficial elder, teaching young ones about their heritage while helping adult survivors heal from centuries of trauma. He nodded to her as she passed, respect and gratitude evident in his ancient eyes. The original 12 had become leaders in their own right. Cardinal worked with the Galactic Council now, serving as an ambassador for his species, traveling to worlds that had never seen a Draconix in person and teaching them what Sarah had taught him. Azure had become a researcher, studying empathic abilities across different species and publishing papers that were revolutionizing how the galaxy understood emotional intelligence. Ember led the settlement's security force, a position that would have seemed ironic if it were not so perfect. Who better to understand the need for controlled strength than someone who had learned from birth that power without discipline was dangerous? Shadow taught philosophy at a university on one of the core worlds. His classes always full of students eager to learn from a species they had been taught to fear. Opal had surprised everyone by becoming an artist whose work was displayed in galleries across 20 systems. Her sculptures, created using precisely controlled plasma breath to shape metal and stone, had changed what people thought was possible. The others had found their own paths, each contributing something unique to the growing Draconics community and to the galaxy at large. Sarah reached the education center, a new building designed for the specific purpose she was about to witness. Inside, 3 clutches of eggs were arranged in the traditional circle pattern, surrounded by comfortable spaces for the adults who would welcome the hatchlings. The original 12 were all present, along with several adult survivors and a handful of researchers from other species who had been specifically invited to observe. This would be the first time the Draconix hatchlings would be raised entirely by their own species since the homeworld was destroyed. Sarah was there only as a witness, no longer needed as a surrogate parent. That role would be filled by Kronos and the other adults, with the original 12 serving as guides and mentors. It was how it should have always been. The first egg began to crack, and Sarah felt tears she did not bother to hide. She had given the Draconix a chance to survive. They had taken that chance and turned it into a future. These hatchlings would grow up knowing they were valued, knowing their history, knowing that they were part of something larger than themselves. They would never experience the fear and isolation that had defined their species for so long. Cardinal stood beside her, now massive and magnificent, his scales gleaming in the light. He had come specifically for this hatching, interrupting important diplomatic work because some things mattered more than politics. He leaned his great head down to her level, and she placed her hand on his scales, a gesture as familiar now as breathing. He spoke quietly, his voice carrying through the translator. He told her that none of this would exist without her. Not just the settlement, not just the legal recognition, but the belief that they deserved to exist on their own terms. She had given that to them when nobody else would. Sarah shook her head. She had provided the opportunity, yes, but they had done the work. They had proven themselves, had changed minds and hearts across the galaxy through their actions. She was proud of them, incredibly proud, but the credit belonged to them. The hatchlings emerged one by one, and the chamber filled with the sounds of new life. The adult Draconix gathered around, their empathic senses reaching out with welcome and love. This was what Sarah had always envisioned, what she had spent years working toward. The Draconix raising their own young, passing on their culture, building a future that was theirs to define. One of the researchers, a Vrelin whose species had once called for the extermination of all Draconics, watched with visible emotion. She had spent 3 years studying at the settlement, documenting everything, trying to understand how she and her entire species could have been so wrong. She had become an advocate, using her position to push for similar recognition and protection for other species that were treated as threats. That was perhaps the greatest legacy of what had happened here. The Draconics had become a symbol, proof that fear and prejudice could be overcome if someone was willing to try. Across the galaxy, beings who had been marginalized or persecuted for what they were pointed to the Draconic story as evidence that change was possible. Sarah's communicator chimed. A message from Commander Vexari, who had remained a friend and supporter over the years. He was retiring from his position with the conservation fleet and wanted her to know that his replacement was a Draconix, one of the original 12. Shadow had accepted the position, bringing his unique perspective to conservation efforts across the galaxy. She smiled, sending back congratulations. The original 12 had spread so far, accomplished so much. They had taken the chance she gave them and multiplied it, creating opportunities not just for themselves but for every Draconix who came after. The hatchlings were being cleaned and fed now, the adults moving with practiced care. Kronos hummed an ancient song, one that had not been sung over hatchlings in 800 years. The young dragons responded to it, their own voices joining in on pure instinct, genetic memory awakening to sounds that felt like home. Sarah recorded it all, documenting this moment like she had documented everything else. But this time the documentation felt different. This was not about proving the Draconics deserved to exist. This was about preserving a moment of pure joy, of a species reclaiming what had been stolen from them. As the day turned to evening, the settlement gathered for a celebration. Draconics and beings from a dozen other species shared food, stories, and companionship. Children of various species played together under the watchful eyes of adults who had learned that trust was built through actions, not assumptions. Cardinal found Sarah sitting alone on a ridge overlooking the settlement, watching the lights come on as darkness fell. He settled beside her, his presence a comfortable weight. They sat in silence for a long time, two beings who had changed each other's lives in ways neither could have predicted. He asked her if she ever regretted it. All the risk, all the sacrifice, all the years of her life devoted to raising 12 strangers' children. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the evening air. She told him that regret required believing you had made a mistake, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life. The Draconics had never been monsters. They had been orphans, the last survivors of a dead world, treated as threats because nobody bothered to see past their teeth and claws. Someone needed to look deeper, to offer hope instead of fear, to build a shelter where they could learn to be themselves. She had done that, but more importantly, they had taken that shelter and built from it something far greater than she had ever imagined. They had created a community, a culture reborn, a future where Draconix children could grow up knowing peace. Down in the settlement, the hatchlings were settling into their first sleep, surrounded by family safe and loved. The galaxy had thought Sarah was going to destroy them, or at the very least be destroyed by them. Nobody had imagined she was crafting them a shelter of hope, a foundation from which an entire species could rebuild. But she had. And they had. Together, they had proven that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was not plasma breath or claws or scales. It was the belief that some lives mattered less than others, that some beings were beyond saving, that fear was more powerful than hope. Sarah Chen had bet her life on hope winning. The settlement below, filled with light and laughter and the sounds of young dragons dreaming of tomorrow, was proof that sometimes, against all odds, love was stronger than fear. The stars above shone down on Kepler 442b, on a community that should not exist, on a future that everyone said was impossible. Sarah smiled, Cardinal's steady presence beside her, and thought about 12 eggs that had changed the galaxy. She had given them a shelter. They had built a home, and that home would stand, would grow, would welcome every lost Draconix until none remained alone in the darkness. The shelter of hope had become something far more precious. It had become a place where monsters learned they had always been people, waiting for someone to notice. Sarah Chen had noticed. The galaxy would never be the same.